To open this morning, I would like to welcome Professor Paul Bennett. Paul is a clinical academic psychologist. He's published research on the psychological impact of VITT, and while he is currently an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Swansea and a clinical psychologist providing support for vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis, or VITT, patients for Thrombosis UK, he continues to be involved in VITT studies that look at the impact of the disease on individuals. So I'm delighted to welcome him to discuss living with the consequences of vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis 1 year post-vaccine. If you'd like to share your screen.
Hello, everybody. Here we go. So, here we are. Right.
While you're sharing your screen, I'll just remind people, if they have any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat functions to send in your questions during this session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And hello, everybody. Let me just adjust my camera. I tend to move around a lot. When I'm talking in lectures, I pace. I like to keep people's eyeballs busy. So when I'm sitting in a chair, I can't help but move around. So welcome, thank you for coming to the talk. You'll notice it's slightly changed the title on the PowerPoint in front of you, which is now Living with the Consequences of VITT. When we started work, or when I started work with people that had VITT, it was around the first anniversary for many of them of their vaccine and the onset of VITT. But time has moved on a little bit now, so I've thrown a curveball at Joe by changing the title. I'd also like to thank Mercy Duradola, who's helped me with a little bit of the data analysis and she's based at Swansea University. So what I want to talk about really is, what is VITT? Why, as a psychologist, am I involved with people that have VITT? And a little bit about the service that Thrombosis UK is now providing people with VITT. So I'll start off with a few quotes that really sort of, I think, well, they're pretty miserable quotes, if I'm absolutely honest. These are some direct quotes from people. Now, don't forget, the people that I'm seeing have psychological ongoing psychological issues, but these are actually taken from interviews with a range of people, many of whom were not seeking psychological support, because we're doing a study looking at these sort of things. And they are the most dramatic quotes, to be fair, but nevertheless, they sum up some of the issues here. I frequently wish I hadn't survived VITT. I often think if I just stopped taking the meds, it would come back and then I wouldn't have to carry on. And that's a quote from a chap who was a club runner, had his own business, and now can't walk more than about 100 yards. If he goes out, he goes on a scooter. He's lost his business, and life has turned pretty bad for him. I feel very ashamed of how I feel and how I am coping. I've completely isolated myself from everyone but my closest family. I don't recognize the person I've become or understand how this person can fit in the world. I'm on duloxetine for nerve pain, but I still want to cry when I think of it, and still hugely worried about my health and the future. So the psychological consequences of VITT for many people that have experienced it are highly significant. And that's why, as a psychologist, I'm involved with working with some of these people. So I'd like to start by thinking, why is VITT so damaging to mental health? We know why it's damaging to health, but why is it so damaging to mental health? And it's worth reminding people of some of the physical health consequences, the immediate consequences, and then some of the continued health problems that people experience. And I'll be talking about some of these a little bit later as well. So according to the sort of authorities, VITT occurs between 4 to 42 days post-vaccination, or at least begins at 4 to 42 days. Around 10 days seems to be the sort of median time that these things occur post-vaccine. And the consequences, the symptoms that people experience vary significantly. Essentially what happens is that, as I'm sure you're aware, people have clots and people may also have bleeds. And the clots are in unusual places. They're not necessarily in the traditional places associated with VTE. And depending where the clot is, there will be the symptoms that people experience. So frequently there are clots in the brain, the hepatic area, lungs, kidneys people talk about. So people may experience severe headaches. I mean, these are migraine level headaches that people experience. Visual changes, abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, back pain, shortness of breath, leg pain, petechiae. So there's a whole range of sudden and relatively dramatic symptoms that people experience. And I'll talk about how some of those were managed a little bit later on, because the management of those symptoms for many people has added to the long-term stress that they're experiencing. A year later, what are we finding? Well, obviously, as I say, I'm seeing a sort of group of people that have continued psychological problems. So maybe I'm seeing the worst of the cases, although I suspect not. But these are some of the things that people have talked about. Continued shortness of breath. As I say, the runner who is now in a wheelchair and a mobility scooter because walking induces significant shortness of breath due to lung damage. Reduced physical ability. Some people are talking about, hemiparesis or similar. Headache is still very common, and people talk about very isolated areas of pain. Other people talk about tinnitus and so forth. There's one well-known person with this who had a limb amputated. Fatigue. One of the most common things that people talk about is a long, debilitating fatigue, muscle pain, and the sort of classic brain fog, memory, concentration issues. As I say, many people have recovered completely, but for some people, these are the types of issues that they are still dealing with and maybe need some psychological support in doing so. So what makes it worse? What adds to these symptoms to make these people experience the psychological sequelae that they are? Well, for many, if you imagine people turning up in casualty with the symptoms of VITT, for many people, they were unknown. Nobody really knew what VITT was because some of these are very early cases. And so they were being told by their clinicians, we don't really know what we're doing. We think we're doing it right, but we're not sure. And people were spending times in intensive care, or at least some were. Some people were just extremely worried about the form of treatment, about the outcome of the treatment and so forth. And certainly a number of people believed that they were going to die in hospital as a consequence of their symptoms. That's by no means all. As you can see down below, some people thought, well, I haven't got many symptoms. And one person at least said they felt a bit of a fake. They were there surrounded by people that had significant strokes or whatever, and they didn't have too many symptoms. So there was a range of outcomes, but a lot of people had significant levels of fear because of the severity of their symptoms and so forth. In the early days, and therefore affecting many of the people that I saw, but not necessarily just in the early days, a number of people were turned away from hospital on the grounds that they had a migraine, I think one was menopausal symptoms. There were misdiagnoses made, and some people had to go to hospital 2 or 3 times to get some sort of support and get a final diagnosis that then led to appropriate treatment. Some people at least have had access in getting problems in accessing longer term care, and I'll talk about that as we go. In the year following and beyond, which we're now at, people have had to live with that sort of fear of, will this happen again? So they're dealing with the consequences of VITT, that acute stage, what they're left with in terms of symptoms. But they're getting new symptoms, or their symptoms aren't getting any better. And there is that worry about what is the long-term consequences. So people that have fatigue, many of them still have fatigue. Headaches are still commonly reported by the people that I see and so forth. One of the interesting things, and I think this is true of VTE patients as well as VITT patients and many others, in fact, cancer patients and so forth, is that when you're being cared for and having regular trips, so when you're on blood thinners, etc., these people are getting regular contact with medical services. And that's very reassuring. However, once that is removed, then people, not everybody comes off thinners, obviously, but those that are taken off them, they're suddenly removed from that sort of security of knowing that their numbers are appropriate. And many of them find that quite difficult to deal with. Many people have, as I say, long-term difficulties in accessing services, and those vary in quality. You'd be glad to know that hematology is generally brilliant, but not so neurology. And, you know, I was talking to somebody as part of the research we're doing, I'll talk about in a minute, who said, you know, even now their GP, who has had letters saying that the person has had VITT from the hematologist and so forth, is still attributing their symptoms to sort of other physical causes, and they're finding it difficult to get access to relevant services. And the two below are sort of linked, and these are really big issues for the people that I've been speaking to, as I say, both clinically but also in our research. And there is a feeling that these people are ignored. There many of them have tried to tell their stories on things like Twitter, Facebook, and they've been removed. They're struggling to get financial compensation for the very often very severe problems physical problems that they've been experiencing that stop them working, probably now, possibly forever, and so forth. There is a vaccine compensation fund that is available through the government, but I know of 2 people that have actually been able to access that. There's probably more now. Famously, there's a woman called Vicky Spitt, who was bereaved as a result of VITT, who got her compensation about 3 months ago, and some people are now getting it. But that's been a struggle. And there is a feeling that their story is literally being censored and they're not able to talk. People are being labeled as anti-vaxxers, and many of them are understandably cautious about vaccination, but they certainly wouldn't consider themselves an anti-vaxxer. Indeed, the whole problems that they're experiencing were a result of seeking vaccination. But the government, the media, and so forth are largely ignoring their stories. And depends on your political views here, but one of the only TV programs or TV channels that's been willing to really talk about their issues is GB News. And they've had a lot of support from GB News, but that goes to a very limited group of people that are watching that. So, as a result of a number of things, the Thrombosis UK decided to establish a psychological support service for people with VITT. And the reason for that is that it is a time-limited condition. That You know, the number of people getting VITT is now clearly going down, because this was largely associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and that is no longer given. So there's a cohort of people that are in acute need, would benefit from some psychological support, and that will be time limited, as is the service. The plan is not to provide it long term, but just to get people through that hump of crises that they're experiencing. And if you look at the NICE guidelines, they say that people with VITT should be given access to psychological support. If you look at the actual use and the availability of that support, then many people are just not getting it. You know, it's very difficult to access. People are put on long-term waiting lists, and all the usual issues to do with accessing mental health resources. So from the beginning of this year, Thrombosis UK trustees agreed to fund 2 ways of supporting people with VITT. They are running a closed and moderated Facebook support group, and that's been going since December 2021. And myself, as a clinical psychologist, from the end of January 2022, and the support will be a maximum of 2 years. So since then, working half-time and consulting people via Zoom, everything is via Zoom because people are from all over the country. I've seen now 44 people for more or less numbers of sessions. The average age is 49, roughly, and most participants, when the thing started, were about a year anniversary of their vaccine, but as time's progressed, clearly that's sort of moving on now, and people have moved on. What I've got down in the right-hand column here is some of the scores that people were getting from psychometric instruments. And the scores may not mean very much, but the cutoff that you'll see written to these indicates the number of people that would have a clinically significant level of something. And the numbers underneath are the equivalent percentages for a general cohort of VTE patients. So we need to be careful here, or I need to be careful here, because the numbers underneath are from a typical group of non-selected VTE patients, whereas the numbers in bold for the VITT group are actually from those seeking support. So they're not really comparable, but I just thought I'd put them there just to show you a little bit of comparison. So what do these letters all mean? Well, the first is something called the impact of event scale, which measures, it's a measure of post-traumatic stress, or PTSD. And it has a cutoff score above which you're likely to be diagnosed with PTSD if you were to have a proper, full clinical assessment. And 61% of the people that I've seen actually achieve that cutoff. Now, a lot of that, which we'll come to, isn't so much the traditional flashbacks, but more rumination, worry, concern, reflection. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. The second one down, HAI, is health anxiety inventory. And that is a measure of specific health anxiety, surprise, surprise. And again, unsurprisingly, 66% of people would reach a cutoff for having clinical levels of specifically health-related anxiety. The scores underneath are more general scores. They're used for people that have, they're more typically used in general populations. And the PHQ is a measure of global depression, and 41% of people have that. And the GAD, general anxiety measure, is 50% of people. So there's a lot of psychological, measurable psychological problems that these people are experiencing. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what those are. I've talked a bit, obviously, already, but a little bit more. One of the critical things is intrusive worries. People worry about their symptoms, surprisingly, or sorry, not surprisingly. If they have sensations, they get interpreted as symptoms. What is this? I have an ache. Is this a sign that things are happening again? And a lot of people get stuck in ruminations about thinking back to what life was like, what life will hold for the future, and can get very stuck into literally just sitting there and sort of dwelling on topics. So there's an acute sort of, what's going on? I've got a headache. Is this VITT again? Am I going to die? Do I need to go to hospital? Most don't. They weather it through and cope, but there is that question. And the other side of that is that there is this more chronic, debilitating. When I go to bed, I ruminate on things and I don't sleep and I have nightmares. So this health anxiety and worry is a predominant feature for most people. The other thing that I think comes through most is fatigue. These people have very high levels of fatigue. People need to go to bed for an hour during the day. Previously active people struggle, even if they have the physical ability, there's no problems with their lungs or whatever. Long walks are problematic. They're just too tired. Work is problematic because just working, I'm thinking of one lady I saw who worked in Tesco's, and she was on a sort of graded return to work, and simply getting on the bus, going to work a shift and coming home was absolutely exhausting, and she had to have a lot of rest and maybe sleep after doing that, and really struggled to get back. And in fact, she had to cut the hours that she worked because it was just simply too tiring. And that is a very familiar story. This fatigue is significantly problematic. More disparate, shall we say, but clearly frequent. These people have experienced significant loss. They've experienced loss of health, loss of job, loss of hobbies, mobility, financial stability. People have lost businesses, people have not been able to get to work and they've lost their jobs. The government vaccine support is essentially £120,000 maximum if you get it. And as a 30-year-old who'd lost his job with 2 children, whose wife didn't work, was saying, that ain't going to do very much. So these people have significant financial concerns about the future, many of them. And they've lost things that are absolutely central to them. And as a consequence, understandably, that they're feeling depressed and down. Interestingly, many sort of fight through that. The guy that I told you about who was on a scooter and unable to run, he has periods of absolute despair, but he also has periods of active. And when I talk to him via email, he gives me hints on my running and tells me what I should be doing and so forth. So, it's not total gloom and despair, but there are periods when these people feel very down. There is a degree of anger, mostly aimed at the government, aimed at the vaccine producers, AstraZeneca in particular, about the lack of support that they're having. Self-confidence, ego is damaged. I mean, you go from a productive person, somebody of value within the family unit as a consequence of job, of role as parents, of husband, wife, partner, etc. And now that's gone. People feel that they've lost it and become dependent and feel very concerned about their dependence on people, and their sort of self-esteem disappears or reduces as a consequence. very much like, I mean, it has been linked to the chronic fatigue syndrome. A lot of these people experience brain fog, concentration problems, along with that more global fatigue. And so they find it difficult to concentrate. And as a consequence, people's jobs are at risk and so forth. Even people that are working from home and doing relatively non-complex work. And I'm probably insulting the person I'm going to talk about now, but there was one person whose job was making videos of for Amazon of unpacking, taking things out of the package, talking about them, so that the Amazon viewers can understand what was in there. And he went from probably making 10, 12 videos a week to 1 or 2 videos, because he simply couldn't concentrate, couldn't engage in that sort of effort of being coherent in front of camera, doing the video editing and so forth. And that was brain fog, concentration problems that he was experiencing. Nightmares, if you think about the number of people that had post-traumatic stress disorder, at least were potentially identifiable as having that, then a lot of these people have nightmares. They have memories about the events. Now, by the time that I was interviewing or seeing them a year on, mostly they'd rescinded, but there's a couple of people certainly that had continuing nightmares and memories of events that happened. And panic, you know, when people have symptoms, there's that immediate panic. And some people had panic attacks. Mostly it was just like an acute anxiety, but some people were literally having panic attacks when they were having symptoms. So there's a range of anxiety, trauma, and depression type symptoms as a result of the trauma of the event, and also the sort of long-term consequences of living with the consequences of that. A little bit more, and these I've already talked about a little bit, so some of these I will sort of skip over or comment, but people still have future concerns. And it's quite interesting that you know, at one level, you could argue, well, VITT was a one-off consequence as an insult to the sort of system, so to speak, as a result of the vaccine, and therefore should not occur again. But a lot of medics find it very difficult, for understandable reasons, to be absolutely definitive that things are not going to get worse or redevelop. And often when patients or people talk about things, when asked their medics, some are reassuring, some say, well, we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And that lingers and gets people very worried. There is concern about the long term, finance, jobs, homes, etc. And there's several people I'm aware of that are thinking, well, we might have to sell the house because we can't afford the mortgage, or we need the capital, etc., etc. So these are real issues. The ego challenges we've talked about, residual PTSD, I've talked about dreams. Hypervigilance is a consequence of PTSD, and hypervigilance is essentially you're always on the alert. You're looking for symptoms, you're looking for problems, you're more likely to get anger, you're more likely to get anxious, and so forth. You're in a state of literally hyperarousal, chronic hyperarousal, not massive, but you're more likely to get angry, you're more likely to respond to situations in a slightly more catastrophic, anxiety, stressful way. So there's a residual PTSD. Most people, as I say, the sort of defining feature of PTSD is often flashbacks, you know, feelings that you were there. Those have typically receded by the time I see them after a year, but they were there. And I think this investment in challenge, I think this is an interesting issue, because if you talk to people that have got VITT, there's a number of support groups out there, and there's a number of groups that are seeking compensation. There's a couple of solicitors, that, one of whom has a particularly large group of people that are representing people, the VITT victims, in terms of litigation, and is trying to get some money. Now, one of the beefs that people have is that in the original documentation, when the government bought the vaccines, within that sort of purchase, there was a get out clause for the providers of those, that they would not be subject to litigation should there be issues. So these may be long shots, but many people are investing very heavily in terms of time, effort, and getting their story out in these sorts of groups. And there are a number of people that are pretty active on Twitter, cautiously, because, as I say, people have been removed from Twitter, and a number of them have been removed a number of times, but they are very powerful advocates of the experience of these people, and they're working through lawyers and so forth to try and get some degree of compensation. The Thrombosis UK Facebook, closed Facebook, is very much used. People find that an incredible use and helpful way of gaining information, gaining emotional support, and so forth. That is really helpful. But other people say, I don't want to do that. You know, this perpetuates and keeps the whole thing going, and have actually actively avoided that sort of contact with those sorts of groups or other people with VITT and so forth. And over the time period following VITT, there has been, I think, people have invested quite heavily in these support groups, but a number of people are beginning to drift away. And I think that sort of represents a sort of moving on from being a sort of VITT patient to someone that had VITT in the past, but is now moving on and doesn't consider themselves necessarily in that light anymore. So this is an interesting issue, I think, watching those things happen. So what are we doing? What am I doing? And what can be done to help these people? Well, I'm probably now taught myself out of a job if Joe's listening, because it's pretty simple, really. No, it's not that simple, but there are some very standard, if I'm honest, strategies for helping people cope with these issues. And there are leaflets, in fact, available on the Thrombosis UK website that talks through some of these issues. And these are useful for people with similar problems, intrusive worries, concerns with VTE, not just VITT. And the way that we help people cope with their intrusive worries, there's some fairly standard means of looking at how to do that. And you can see them, some of them written down here: distraction and worry postponement, mindfulness, playing games with thoughts, writing exercises, not cognitive challenge, but we'll come to that in a second. So this is dealing with the sort of chronic, intrusive, I sit and I spend a lot of time worrying, or when I get a symptom, I then, or a sensation that I'm concerned is a symptom, then it takes me back and I think, and I find it difficult to pull myself out. The sort of classic way of dealing with that is something called distraction and worry postponement. And the way that works is that people choose, I always think of it as they gain control about when they think about these issues. So it's not that people don't think about their concerns, but they choose when to think about them. So the idea of worry postponement is that you have a time in the day that you elect to think about the concerns that you have. Now, you don't have to use it, but it's there if you want it. Any other time that you get those intrusive worries come along, you actively distract. And that can be engaging in whatever's going on in a mindful, in a thorough manner. It can be reading a book. It can be literally anything that takes concentration. So for me, What I do is, because I'm an old and rather memory fatigued music fan, I try and think of 10 band names beginning with A, 10 beginning with B, 10 beginning with C. And although I've done this many times, I still can't think towards the end. But this is active distraction. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, I try and read a book and I can't think, it doesn't work. If you read a book, just to give an example of the effort required for this sort of distraction, if you're reading a book, it is reading a book in a way that is absolutely filling your concentration. You know, most people have read a book and 3 pages later, they've got no idea of the plot, but their worries are still there. So in this case, it is reading it in a way that really takes concentration, almost like reading it if you're reading it to a friend and trying to make it exciting and interesting. So this distraction can take quite a lot of effort. But the hope and the usual way is that the more you do it, the easier it gets. And that habit of worry sort of fades over time. But you have to combine those two things, because people can let go of their worries because they know, I'm going to think about this at 5 o'clock tonight for 20 minutes. If they don't do that, it's not a problem. But the two work nicely in combination. Mindfulness, I'm not going to talk about too many of these now, because people can answer questions or people can talk about them. But mindfulness, very, I was going to say trendy, which is doing a disservice really. It's very popular at the moment as a means of engaging and sort of, it's not distracting away from thoughts. It is engaging and focusing on the whole experience so that the thoughts that people have are sort of minimized and no longer sort of dominate the experience. So it's not distraction, because distraction is trying to block the thoughts and think of other things, but it is trying to sort of disengage from them. We've got leaflets that we can download, or you can download on the website for both of those things. Playing games, just saying stupid things about your thoughts. Writing exercises. Write a letter to your MP. People write to their MPs all the time and get nothing. There are a couple of MPs, Christopher Choke is one of those, who has taken them on board, but most of the time they write to their MP and tell about their problems and not a lot happens. If people are having absolute panics, then there are some really simple things that can be done to support them. And one of the simplest is just breathing exercises, learning to slow the breathing down. Panic is about the body moving into arousal to deal with stresses, things that are happening, on the alert. They call it the fight-flight response. And a very simple way of calming that down is actually through nice, slow, diaphragmatic breathing. So as you breathe, the diaphragm goes out, you're breathing from the bottom of the lungs. And you can combine that with some sort of reassurance. Or one of the things that we often do with people that are worried that their symptoms, their experiences are a sign of a problem is, don't make that assumption. You've had these before. It wasn't before. Do the breathing. Try and talk yourself down. Remind yourself that you've had these experiences before and they didn't turn out to be another pulmonary embolism or whatever. If after a certain amount of time nothing has happened, then you may want to take other actions. But the first action is one of calm, trying to slow down. And that works very well because, again, you have a plan of action that people engage with and work on. One of the interesting things that's come through is nightmare rescripting, which is to get people to talk about nightmares and imagine them ending in a very positive and a very different way. And there's quite a bit of recent evidence that that works. In terms of depression, again, these are general things, but there's been a lot of sort of shifting from being a, sort of dwelling to some extent, but trying to get and almost fighting to get the old you back, but now setting new goals, making the new you that may be different, but it's no worse or better, it's just different. And a nice example of this is a musician that I saw, very, very good guitarist, and really struggling. And one of the really things that he found most helpful was, why don't you play the harmonica? Something that he could do, something he could learn and get a, and that actually made a fundamental change, because it began to shift from the retrospective feeling of loss to more positive goals that were achievable, doable, and so forth. It's not the only thing that worked or benefited him, but that was a sort of process. Again, managing fatigue. I'm sure most of you are aware, the idea of pacing, not doing too much, not doing too little. And we do quite a bit on relaxation and breathing, which is slightly different, I guess, slightly unusual, in that, the argument will be that if while you're doing things, you're wound up, you're tight, you're tense, then it takes effort to do that, and that effort becomes problematic. So trying to take it easy, trying to relax. And I think the way I look on fatigue is that there are two elements to it. There are those that are central to the condition, and there is fatigue that now comes because these people haven't done very much for a year or so. So they've lost fitness, they've lost strength. And whilst that central fatigue may be more difficult to sort of moderate and mediate, some of those other fitness issues can be worked on, and people can make meaningful, albeit slow, general progress to doing more and feeling less tired. And as I say, the sort of investment in challenge, some people love to support and get a lot out of their own, but help a lot of people, representing and supporting people, whereas other people avoid those things and find them problematic. So I put for the future, but these are the things that are now going on. We are doing a study where a lot of the stuff that I've talked about has come from, interviewing people with VITT, so not just people with mental health issues, but a wider VITT population. And we're writing, hopefully writing a paper for BMJ Open, describing some of their experiences. I think we've had 10 interviews so far with people with VITT and 2 with bereaved family members, where obviously their partner developed it and died. And we probably want to get up to 15 patient interviews. The interviews are horrendously long. Most of them get up to 2 hours. People really want to tell their story, and we hope we can really represent these people's experiences as a result of that. We do have information about coping with psychological sequelae to both VITT and VTE on the Thrombosis website, and we're hoping to sort of further develop those to maybe make them, at the moment they're sort of fairly bullet points. We may well develop those to make them a little bit deeper and a little bit more sort of readable as a booklet, rather than a try this, try this, try this. And again, finally, we're looking at offering training for health professionals in basic psychology, working with VITT and VTE patients. And those will be interactive online and hopefully exciting and enjoyable. And that's it. So I shall click off this and go to stop share. Oh, Joe's magically appeared. And if there's any questions or issues, I'm happy to expand or not, as the case may be.
Thank you, Paul. That was really interesting and insightful into the experience that many of these individuals have gone through and are still obviously facing and in many ways struggling with. There are questions coming in. Something I just wanted to ask. So I know you've obviously done a lot of research about the impact of VT on individuals. Did you find the impact of VITT more severe than VTE, or similar, or different in any way?
I think, well, it's interesting because we talked about the problems of, one of the big issues that people face, sorry, I'm just going to move that down, don't want to give you all vertigo, is that problem of getting into hospital and not being, And that certainly amongst many VTE patients, that's a similar experience, particularly younger people, where thrombosis may not be an expected diagnosis. So some of the experiences are very common to both to VTE and VITT. And I think that unknown element of VITT certainly adds to the problems that these people are experiencing. And but there are also many commonalities to this fear of the future. And in some ways, VTE is possibly more anxiety provoking than VITT, because VITT was a one-off, hopefully, whereas, and people are being either said, well, I'm not sure, or no, you should be fine now, that was a one-off. Whereas people with VTE may be getting slightly less positive messages of there's a chance of recurrence and so forth. So I think the challenges that these people are facing are different, but in the end, there's a lot of commonalities: fear of the future, anxiety, a lot of people with pulmonary thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, for example. You know, if they get short of breath going up a flight of stairs, it's like, oh my goodness me, what's going on? And can get quite panicky. So there's a lot of commonalities between these people.
And I guess also because the numbers in the whole population are fairly low, it is really difficult to ensure that everybody is fully aware of VITT, the symptoms and the management. Now, you touched upon a number of resources that the charity has available, both as downloads and also obviously Facebook, and if required, the clinical psychological service. For healthcare professionals, what has been developed or what is in the process of being developed that may help them at least understand or be able to foster those conversations? Because I know you mentioned a lot of the issues about being listened to and being feeling you were taken seriously and understood.
Well, the idea is to provide some support and get people thinking about those sorts of issues. So later, actually, in this session, today, we've got a round table of people talking about communication issues in VTE. And we're also planning, Joe's just slapping me quietly on the wrist now for not mentioning them. We're running or planning to run some, what are they called? Podcasts? That's the name, yes. Showing my age here. Talking with key individuals, clinicians, and so forth, working with VTE patients to tease out and look at what are the issues in communication for people with VTE and so on and so forth. And to me, it's a really interesting issue because people take these away. You know, people take comments away, people take, you know, one of the really strange things is that one of the best predictors of adherence to medication is if you get on well with your doctor, if you believe that you're going to be listened to. So a lot of these communication issues that perhaps we don't think about as much as we should are actually critical to the patient process and keeping people on board, reducing anxiety and so forth. So we're talking to, at the moment, we have plans with an acute care physician and a primary care physician to talk about some of these issues. But we may well do others as well, depending on how things go, nurses and so forth.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really interesting. And as one of the audience members said, thank you for highlighting this important subject, which he feels is being ignored in the main. So well done. Unfortunately, I'm very conscious of time. It's been a brilliant session, has been recorded and will be available for rewatching and catch up. Paul is also coming on for a session a little later today, I think at 1 o'clock. But otherwise, thank you very much, Paul. And I look forward to welcoming the audience to the next session, which starts at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't actually see you, but if there is anyone there, thank you very much for listening and your interest. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.